Sorry.
Evening all. Sound like a policeman, don't I? Good evening. Welcome to the Little Ship Club for older faces we haven't seen for some time. Very pleased to see a few people that come back to the fold, or thanks to COVID weren't able to come along until recently. Delighted to introduce Dawn, who's one of the full-time professional divers, I believe, for the... You have lots of amateurs, yes. But I'm sure you'll tell us about it. I confessed earlier, and I've confessed to Dawn, that I haven't been to the museum. Despite sailing past the yellow buoy, etc. every time.
I bet none of them have been.
It's probably as close as I've been to the actual wreck. Without further ado.
Okay, great, thank you. Just before I get on camera, I'll streamline it, so I'm going to be careful what I'm saying. So you see, I divert and tell a few stories, but I'm going to have to be really careful about stories, so I won't take them after. So, where am I going to stand? Here?
Fine.
Make sure everything's working. Hello everybody, it's really lovely to be here with you all this evening. To talk about one of the most interesting parts of our history, and that is about the fascinating, underwater project that's ever been undertaken in modern archaeology today, and that is the raising of King Henry VIII's Tudor warship, the Mary Rose.
In Hull and the artifacts found within it, it is now possible to build up a picture of life aboard the Mary Rose. A ship that was shrouded in mystery can now be brought to life.
With the Mary Rose in 1979 when I was trained to be an engineer, and I used to go down to one of the largest locations in Plymouth for training school for divers. And it was then that I met Margaret, and she got talking to me and she said, "Oh, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to be an engineer." She said, "Well, why don't you come and down and dive with us in Solent?" And I was a northerner at that stage, and she said, "We're going to bring up a shipwreck." And I thought, shipwreck? Why on earth would you want a shipwreck? I've dived on shipwrecks in the Isles of Scilly and over in Scotland and various areas around the coast, and I thought, who would on a shipwreck? So I said, okay, fine. So she said, look, think about it, here's my card, and then you can come down and join us to bring the shipwreck up. So I thought, okay, so I thought about it 2 weeks, finished my ONC, and I thought, right, I'm going down. But not knowing then, as a young person as I was, the international interest it has created, and, amongst people like ourselves, our children, grandchildren, the doctors, the scientists, the historians, the archaeologists, who will still continue to do the research into most of the objects that we found and into the DNA of the skeletons, so we can really find out what Tudor life was really like over 400 years ago. I feel privileged having had that experience. I don't know what I've done had I not gone down, because my main ambition was to be an engineer. I wanted to design bridges. Probably not build them, but design them. But that never happened. But before I just continue, I just want to tell you and show you something, a little clip that was taken from the Oracle of Margaret Ruhl, a person who was very inspirational to me at that time, and I think to most of our team. There was 7 of us as a full-time diving team. We only got paid £5 a day, but it was well worth it at that time. Probably be different to make that decision now. But this is the lady that gave us that inspiration to actually keep going, and she made every day so exciting for us because she wanted to see what we would find of our next object.
It will be a minor miracle. It's been tough going, a tough year with lots of discussions, and I believe we've now got it right. I think we can do it. We can lift the ship from the seabed, move her gently across underwater, locate her, the legs of the lifting frame, in the feet of this cradle, using sonar docking, acoustic navigation ways to dock the legs with the feet very exactly, and then very gently jack her down into that supporting structure. When we've done that, and that's all underwater, then we smile. The lift into air is just a perfectly straightforward piece of lifting into air. We have excellent equipment to do it with. It's straightforward. We can do it even up to the end of November, if needs be. But the movement underwater and the docking is crucial, and we have to do that within the next few weeks.
What could go wrong?
And I think that when we put it down, we find she doesn't fit. Then we, I think, get the next boat to South America. Because if she doesn't fit, we have a problem. We have to fabricate on the seabed, and that will be difficult. And if the weather picks up like this, we'll never do it.
Well, that's the type of person we had to work with, and she was really lovely and a joy to work with during that time. So today in my talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the sinking of the Melrose, a little bit about the excavation of the Melrose, and a little bit about the raising of the Melrose, because as you can appreciate, there's so much to tell you about this subject. And when I said I was going to be here 3 hours, then I think Nick nearly had a fit. So he said no, just 45 minutes. So I'm going to do my best in that time for you. So on the 19th of July 1545, everything and everyone that was on that ship at that moment in time was captured like a snapshot of Tudor life as it was then over 400 years ago. It wasn't until 1982, 437 years later, that the Melrose was raised from the seabed using the most advanced underwater equipment at that time and the most skillful of divers. When she was brought up on 11th of October, then she was put into the big crate, which I'm going to explain more about later, and she was brought in to be housed. A big polythene sheeting was placed over her. For nearly 34 years that she was at war, she was actually in conservation process for at least 34 years, where she was washed down with clear water, recycling water, and then like a glycol, like a plastic glycol, that was then sprayed to actually fill out the cracks and dry her out even more. She's still on that frame that she was lifted up from the seabed at that time. I think if that frame wasn't under her, I think she would collapse altogether. That's her life and soul. It's like a little silver frame, and she'll always be there with her, and it gives her that support now.
Excuse me, I wear hearing aids and you're speaking very quick.
Should I slow down a little bit?
Please.
Okay, I will slow down for you. So when shall I repeat that for you? Shall I just repeat that for you? The Melrose was on the seabed 437 years, and when she was finally raised from the seabed using the most advanced underwater equipment and the skillful divers at that time, she was then brought into the museum and she was housed in a polythene sheeting, and that's where she was doing her conservation process for at least 34 years until she went on to full view for the public, general public, to view her. But let's just take the clock back just a little bit in time to Tudor history. There's a great deal on the TV that you can now get, but when King Henry VII passed away, King Henry was next in line to the throne, only being 17, just 18 at the time, being a very well-educated man in literature, art, music, poetry. He was always determined to get his own way, and during 1509, not only did he marry Catherine of Aragon, but he was crowned King of England. He made many changes to our England at that time with everything that he did when he was sitting on the throne. But unlike his father, he didn't want to beg, borrow and steal ships from others to fight wars. He wanted to build the biggest and the most permanent navy base that ever existed. So he started off by sending his men out, probably to the local forest, to the Forest of Dean, maybe the New Forest, and had 2 ships commissioned to be built in the Portsmouth dockyard, one being the Melrose and one being the Peter Pomegranate. Both of these ships were towed to one of the largest shipbuilding locations on the Thames to be completely fitted with her flags, the banners, the guns, the cannons. She was the most beautiful ship of all, and she was one of the most powerful warships that had ever been built in Tudor times. She was the fastest, and she was the strongest. And Henry, his vision, he wanted to create an empire on land, but actually, first of all, he had to conquer the high seas. And this is why his technology was far more advanced than any other shipbuilding that had ever existed during that time. The Melrose had fought about 2 wars with the French at that time, and she was then transporting the troops to the Battle of Flodden, to Newcastle. That's what her aim was at that time. Let me get this on. But it wasn't until 1545 that Henry had always made peace treaties with the French king. But in 1544, after he'd made the peace treaty, he went back on his word, and he wanted to fight Blois, and what he did, he sent 30,000 troops north and south until Blois was defeated in September 1544. His spies came back and then informed Henry that the French king, Francois, was very angry, not happy, and he was going to be sending the troops and the ships to England for the battle. So Henry in that time had months ahead to prepare and send every man, woman and child to Southsea seafront to set up their home. This Cowdery painting, as most of you, if you've been to the Mary Rose Museum, you would have seen it, and this is a story in itself. It depicts a lot of the goings-on during that time. It wasn't only a snapshot of that moment in time, what was happening. It depicts the events, the build-up to the sinking of the Mary Rose, and after the Mary Rose had actually sunk. And that's great information story in itself. You see it. You can see Southsea Castle here. This is the whole of the Southsea seafront. And you've got the vanguard of the French fleet over here, it's Bembridge, Point, St Helens. And then you've got the English fleet here. Compared to over 230 ships of the French and 30,000 men, we only had about 12,000 men and about 70 ships. That was because Henry still had troops out in France and they hadn't yet returned. And he was really concerned. And I think this is one of the myths why he was hiring a lot of people from the Spanish Armada in Plymouth at that time that maybe didn't speak English, maybe didn't hear what was going on, or couldn't hear the orders from the boatswain at that time.
Sorry, whereabouts is that exactly?
Yes, this here. This is the Southsea seafront.
Where, sorry?
Southsea seafront.
Southsea.
Yes, and then you've got the Solent here, and then you've got the Isle of Wight. And it's been compressed. But just to give you an idea of the distance from Bembridge here into this sort of castle here, it's about 3 miles. So it shows you how it's compressed. And the reason it's compressed is because this man behind King Henry VIII was his right-hand man. I won't go into the great bit detail, but I'll just tell you the reason we've got this painting. Is the man sitting on the horse right behind King Henry VIII was Sir Anthony Browne, that had commissioned 2 artists to have this Cowdery painting done. They sketched the whole of the scenes, but Sir Anthony Browne lived at Cowdery House in Midhurst. And what he did, he wanted these artists to paint this picture of all the events that was going on the Southsea seafront during that time of 1545, because he wanted to use it for his own benefit, for society, for his friends, for entertaining, so he could tour. And if you notice, he is right behind the king. He's on every picture that was ever painted during all the events of King Henry VIII's time. So it's very fortunate we've got this painting. It wasn't, that's another story itself, but I'll just quickly tell you. So Anthony Browne, who lived at Midhurst, had this painting done. It's about 20 feet long, it's about 8 foot wide. And it was, the Antiquities in London had sent 2 artists to have it etched and engraved. They took a copy of it. 2 years later, Midhurst was actually burnt down, Cowdery House was burnt down. And they've lost it all, but thank God the Antiquities still had a copy of it, and that's the only reason we have it today. Otherwise we wouldn't really know all the events, what went on during that time. So this is the whole of Southsea seafront here. You've got Southsea Castle, you've got the harbour coming into Portsmouth here, and you've got the easterly end here. You've got the Isle of Wight, Bembridge, St Helens Point, and you've got the Isle of Wight right along here, and you've got the small forts here. You've got the French fleet, and then you've got the English fleet and the French fleet here. So what happened on that? Let's just close up a little bit more. You've got the French fleet, as I said, about over 200 ships. Henry, what he did, he always used to have men to protect the Isle of Wight, but he also sent an extra 1,000 troops on the Isle of Wight to protect it, because he knew that if the French did anchor up at Bembridge, then they would be able to get on. It took a couple of months for the French to come over. So they were short on supplies, stores, they needed food, they needed drink. So they ransacked the Isle of Wight, and you can see the English are chasing off the French here, just here. There was a few of the exchange of killings at the time, but they managed to ward them off. And it's funny, when we were in fire, this ship here, I'll show you this close up now, this one here, that's one of the French galleys, that's actually sunken down there. And that was when the battle had commenced, which I'll go a little bit further on in a moment. Probably one of our galleys had fired at the French galley, and that is down in there. And I can't tell you that story at the moment, but that is actually being investigated at the moment. So I'm hoping I'll get lucky to dive on that one. So further along, we've got the pikers just across. We've got King Henry VIII on his horse. So what's interesting really about this painting, what it tells us, King Henry VIII was dining on Great Harry the night before the 15th of July. He's not prepared here for war at all. He was asked to get out off the ship and come into the castle. But he's just looking around at that time, which tells me at that time the Mary Rose hadn't sank. This is probably him just coming to just check what's going on. Then he'd gone to the castle and watched the Mary Rose sink. And then further along, we've got opposite in Eastern End, we've got all the pikers and the bills, we've got the cannons. If anybody knows the Rose Gardens, where they were, this is where the fort used to be. It's just around Sassy Front. It's a really great walk if you ever do come down and look. And then further along, we've got the hot walls. If any of you know the hot walls in Southsea, where they do, there's a lot of sunbathing just over there. And you've got all the pikers and the bills, and you've got the cannons. And then you've got further in on the harbour, you've got the men indicating to these men here that they're trying to lift the chains that stop all the ships coming in. They're trying to lift chains, and what they're doing is they're indicating we can't get the chains up, we can't get them up, they wouldn't manoeuvre. So once all the ships had come out of port, they tried to lift the chains, but there was no succession in that. Now, what's really interesting is the Mary Rose was at one stage positioned further south, which is near the Isle of Wight, and the Great Harry, which was the flagship of the flagship of the fleet at that time. So if you can imagine that's the Isle of Wight and that's Portsmouth Southsea Castle, the Mary Rose was at once south. It had manoeuvred itself right in front of the Great Harry, came in further north, and then moved in further, and it was facing north, it was facing the castle. And that's where she was, which we all find very strange, but it will come to light in a moment. The Great Harry was getting fired at by the galleys. The French had about 24 galleys, the English only had about 12. So that the Great Harry's taking the firing line. This is just to give you an idea. I've just got something in just to show you, if it'll go.
The helpless navy, whilst it was becalmed and a windless sea. Finally, a breeze did spring up, allowing Henry's fleet to move against the galleys.
So, what was happening? The French galleys had manoeuvred forward. The tide was against the French. They couldn't manoeuvre in. There was no wind in the air, so the ships couldn't sail in. The English fleet was still at anchor as well. They couldn't manoeuvre out because when the tide was against them, there was still no wind in the air. But as they were battling each other and firing at each other, did one of the French galleys hit the front of the Mary Rose? The Mary Rose was taking on water gradually. Did the Mary Rose come right in front of the Great Harry? And was she positioned in shallower water while the carpenters were trying to fill the gaps of the holes to stop the water seeping in? This is one of the myths that we still really don't know, because part of the ship is down there and we'll never know that until maybe the next generation take that over. So at that time, the Mary Rose, the Mary Rose sitting, she was firing from her starboard side. They wanted to manoeuvre her round. Orders were given by the boatswain to up the sails, and as she was turning around, she slightly keeled over. A gust of wind came over, caught in her sails. Gunport's only 18 inches above the sea water, started filling in very quickly, and she sank so quickly. She didn't even have time to manoeuvre. That's the real facts, as it was. History has always rewritten itself, and you'll find all sorts of things that are coming out after that. So Henry was sitting at Southsea Castle, mortified, devastated that how could the Mary Rose sink? Everybody but 35 maybe people had been saved by the small boats that had come in to bring them into shore. And Henry was standing with Lord Lyles, who's the Vice Admiral of the Mary Rose at that time. She passed out thinking that her husband was on board at that time. The Mary Rose sank so quickly that the only men that would have probably been saved would have been the men in the crow's nests. Screams could be heard right along the whole of the Southsea seafront. They could hear the screams from all of the men. And they probably wouldn't have been saved because a lot of them couldn't swim and they had the chainmail armour on, which would have actually taken them down. Also, they would have had the anti-boarding netting that Henry put right on the weather decks, right across the whole of ships. And the reason for that is because if the ship got side by side and they were in a man-to-man fight, then if the enemy had got on board, then they would use the large pikes and the bills to actually kill the men that they would come when they come on board. So they probably wouldn't have been able to even get off the board. So that's why the men that were survived probably on the crow's nests or just on the outer part of the decks. Even the knives that they carried, they probably wouldn't have even been sharp enough to cut through the rope. This rope is exactly the size as the anti-boarding netting, but also it would have been covered in tar and it would have been covered in sand. So the knives probably wouldn't have stood a chance to actually cut through anything at all. This will just explain a little bit more.
During this move, in calm seas, the ship took on water, heeled over, and sank. The reason for this disaster has always puzzled me.
And that's where the Mary Rose was. The small sea creatures and that had eaten away the wood over the years. But it wasn't until mid-1800s that the local fishermen kept snagging the ropes on something on the bottom of the seabed. And they asked the Dean brothers, and the Dean brothers were divers, salvage divers at that time, who designed and had patented the hard hat. It was really their use for fighting farm fires, but they came over an accident when one fell in the water and they realised they could breathe underneath it. So they used it for salvaging all the ships at that time. They were asked to go down, find what it was. They found wood that was timbers that were sticking above the seabed, and then they salvaged the wreck for the next 4 years until they retrieved a lot of the items. A lot of the items were sold on the black market, and that was how they made their money at that time. Over the years, sitting on the seabed, the whole of the port side had eroded away, and leaving her just the port of the starboard side underneath. 7 different types of silts have built up over the years, and she was encapsulated. It's an anaerobic situation. We need oxygen to live, but actually oxygen can also kill us if we have a lot of free radicals for a human being. But if it's in an anaerobic situation, the oxygen get in, things came out absolutely like they were brand new, like you see on the table here on display. It wasn't until mid-1960s that Alexander McGee, another very interesting man, I think if it wasn't for Alexander McGee and Margaret Ruhl, who had the vision to actually bring up the Mary Rose, I don't think we would ever have the Mary Rose up in a museum today. But he was more determined to find the Mary Rose. He knew it was down there. He was a historian, so he did a lot of research, found through the archives the old maps that the Dean brothers had used years ago. He went to try to locate it. He had no success after 5 years. He borrowed a lot of equipment from Marconi's, sonar equipment. And when he actually went down with the sonar equipment, it detected that there was something down there on the seabed. And this is the readings that came back using the equipment. All of this had eroded, you can see there. And this came back. He said if there was a shipwreck down there, it's laying on an angle of 60 degrees. It was in just the late 1970s that he approached Margaret Ruhl, who was an archaeologist, and he asked Margaret would she like to join the team with her skill and her expertise on preserving items. So they joined together as a team, and I personally think they were an amazing team. Alexander McGee was a very quiet, reserved man. He didn't say too much. It was Margaret who was the one that really moved things forward. But both of their visions were to see the whole of the Mary Rose in a museum, and they wanted to display all of the items. So they worked a great team together. I loved working with both of them. And then it was in 1979 that I joined the team. But what they had worked on before then is in 1971, they started working on the timbers. They started feeling where the timbers were and exposing the timbers. That was on the port side. In 72 to 3, they'd exposed more of the port timbers and the stern. more 75 to 76, 77, 78, and in 1979, this was what was exposed. Margaret knew at that stage that if this hall is not up within 3 years, then you're not going to have anything at all. That's when she approached the local council, she approached businessmen to make a plan of how they're going to do it. There was no income, there was no government funding. Everything had to be funded by the public itself. They rented the seabed for about £1 a year because this project had never been done internationally before. So what we did when I joined the team, we had a Sleipner just right over the whole site. This was our home for the next 3 years. And underneath, I'm just going to show you a picture underneath I've put down. So this is the Sleipner, and this is the vision of it. Now that's the hull is facing north. These scaffolding poles were placed over the site because Margaret knew that if we're going to dig deeper down, that we would be then treading on maybe objects that were, in danger of breaking or destroying. So we used about 2 airlifts to start with, and I bought one here. This is one of the airlifts. It's not actually the airlift, but that's identical to the airlift. It's a little bit longer, and it was used like a huge hoover, and we'd have to go down there and hoover out any small areas that we were working on. And we would be given our location, then we'd do what we had to do, and then the next diver would go down and then take over from us. And that was the most interesting part. This is the ship on its side, so this is an aerial view itself. And here we've got the hold, and then we go up to the main deck, the upper deck, and then we have the structures of the castle decks. What we see above the castle decks, they are still down there underwater. So total dives in totals was over the 3 years, it's over 27,000 dives. Man hours on the seabed was just over 11, and then the artefacts recovered was over 20,000. The divers we had 7 full-time divers, and then we had up to, in total, 500 divers. We don't know where those divers are now. Probably some have passed away, and some have not really wanted to get involved with it. And we do try and keep in touch with as many divers as we can. But that was the most exciting part. This was our this was our diving platform that we would use to go. There was no health and safety in them days. It was absolutely brilliant. We could just do what we wanted. We loved it. And you could see we had this platform. We'd actually move the sides because we needed to get in and out very quickly. This is myself going down with one of the airlifts here. You can see one being used at the moment. Over the years, we built up to using about 12 airlifts, so we could just get more work done. Now, what makes me laugh? This person here. Nick Ruhl, Margaret Ruhl's son, he's on standby. So I don't know what help he would have done if we actually needed any help down there, but he was just down there ready, okay, we need any help, we're there. This was on a choppy day. The solar tides change very quickly. The wind comes up and it gets really choppy very quickly. I'm sure most of you have sailed in the Solent. And this is the day that we went down, we came up and we just had to sit around. We're just having a good time, the safety boats coming up. And I remember going down on this particular morning, because the tide had changed, we waited for it to get calmer, which you can see it's much calmer now, so everything will continue. But this is one of my best days. I think one of my best dive finds I found was one of the Gold Angels, this one here. So this is one of the Gold Angels, and that was my best dive because I remember it just fell out right in front of me. It was just like it had just been minted. It was amazing. And when I stuck it under my sleeve, and Andy Fielding said, what have you found? 2 gold coins? I went, no, I've only found 1. I thought, who knows? I'm down there. Because the visibility is really dark. Sometimes you can see probably be, about sort of a foot in front of you. This day is really good. We must have had really good sunshine that day. But you can see we're getting deeper into the trenches, and you can see we're hanging on our scaffolding poles. And as we get deeper, we're hanging on with our feet as we get deeper down. In 81, we raised many cannons. Margaret's joy was cannons. She loved to see how many were there. Because the other myth of why the ship sank is, was it because when she tilted slightly on an angle, a few degrees, was it the cannons weren't secured, and had they manoeuvred over and come over to the side and tipped the ship over a little bit more? But over the years, as we discovered, there were 7 cannons still in this porthole, still very secured, so that was the myth that was taken out. Margaret loved to check the emblem on the front, whether it's a rose, the inscription, and we cleaned it down until it then went into the next location, into the warehouse. This is an amazing picture that a couple of fish were always our friends. They travelled around the whole site, they were there for the whole of the years. And you see this, these are two other divers diving down, but you can see how interesting a sighting it is. You just don't know what you're going to find, and I think that was the main thing that kept us going. Who could bring the best item up next time? What was really important is both Alexander McKee and Margaret Ruhl really needed datum. They needed us to draw, sketch, and measure every item, where it was, where it faced, how deep it was, because their visions, when they made a museum, they wanted to put everything back out of the same place as we found it. And that's why if you go to the museum, you'll see half of the ship, but you'll see in the display cabinets, everything we found on that level was displayed in the cabinet further down. This is just a few pictures. What I love about this one here is this is the main deck. This is looking onto forward. And when we actually cleared it, this is the deck all cleared of all the items. Here there was lots of cannons, there was carriages, further it was a whole mound of skeletons. And they were probably the master gunner, and there's about 7 of them in total, and they were probably trying to get up the companionway to get out at that time. But this is what I love, because you just clear, it's like doing housework, you just clear it, it feels great after. Prince Charles came down I think about 7 or 9 times in the end. I met him a few times, but they always used to scuff me in the water before he came. And I couldn't ever talk to him, but he did talk to me at the end, and I did say to him, did he like his jelly, and he liked that bit. But over the years, again, we found many items. These are just a few of the replicas here today, and they are identical to the ones we found. You'll never have the chance of ever feeling anything when you go to the museum, because it's all behind the doors of the show bits. But I think if you want to feel or touch anything, please do mind me and ask me any of the questions. But the bottle you see over here, the wicker bottle, we found that in the up in one of the upper decks in the chest. It was probably filled with wine. It was it came full. It still got the stopper in, and one of them was broken in half. It probably belonged to the officers. They probably had it in one of their personal chests, and that's what it looked like when it came up, and after it was cleaned, it looked absolutely amazing. And then we found, and that's the one again, we found hundreds of plates. Everything that had H on was owned by Henry. He would actually loan it out to everybody during that time. The pewter plates that we found, I mean, if you go to the museum up onto the upper deck, the pewter plates were just absolutely amazing. They come up like brand new. They were owned probably by Sir George Carew. They had his initials on there. He probably took his own personal items. And the shots that we found was all different sizes, shapes, because then they didn't have a mould. They would make the guns and the cannons all different shapes and size until they introduced the blast furnace that then made the cannons from iron, which then all came a standard size. And then the timbers we had to remove, over 3,000 pieces of timber, because you can imagine if the ship had come up, she would be like a sponge, and if you lift a sponge out of water, it would just break out the side. The hull would have broken in half had these timbers not been removed. But by the time 5-7 years had passed, all the timbers were placed back onto the Mary Rose itself. You know, I think finding these items, it's not just about finding them, it's about the people that use them. These were everyday people, just like ourselves, different levels of society. You know, we found not only just wooden ones that the crew would have had, we found the leather ones, and then we found the pewter ones. So it just shows you the levels of society that these people would have had their own personal tankers. The still shore, it's like the early oboe. That was found on the main deck. That was found a couple of years after, it was 1982 I think that was found. And that came in its box. That's a piece of music you can hear after. It's like the oboe and it's a box, but they didn't even know there was an oboe invented then. They didn't think the oboe was invented, or the still shore, until 50 years after the Mary Rose was raised. And it's the only one that we have internationally in the museum itself. You know, we found a pot fiddle, drum. I mean, it probably would have been Sir George Carew that probably would have then had the musicians on board to entertain while they're having their meal. I mean, it's a shame because it was only at sea a few weeks before she actually went down. You know, the fiddle looms would have been there to use to make these huge strops with. The men would have had to, it's a working ship, so they wouldn't have been there just to go and fight battle. They would have had to have worked to make their items that they would need, to lift and move the things about. Then the bobbins, in some of the jerkins of the skeletons, we found their own bobbins, we found the thimbles. The men would have had to do their own repairs, from mending their own outfits to fixing the sails to everything that they would have had to do. Unlike the men of today, they don't need to do that, do they? Get somebody else to do it or pay for it to be done. And then the thimbles that we found, some of the thimbles were still, half the thimbles, like a ring thimble, were still on some of the skeletons, on some of the phalanges of the hands. If you see over here in the moment, we've got the bobbins, the cotton bobbins. They would have had two different types of thread, one a narrow one a thicker one, but the needles were kept inside the bobbins themselves. And they're identical to the ones in the museum. It's just really to see how they would have worked and lived on board at that time. Can't tell you the amount of shoes that we found. We found mounds of shoes everywhere, dotted around the ship in different areas. Men probably wouldn't have worn the shoes on board because it would have been leather and they would have been slipping all over the place. They probably would have been put in to the side in chests. The purser would have owned most of the items because he was the one that would dish out the supplies to the men if they were short of anything. But we found them all over the ship. I mean, you're not telling me if you didn't have a pair of these shoes in the garden, you wouldn't use them. If they were in your shed, you'd use them to go and wash them, wash on the line, wouldn't you guys? I'm sure you would. Or to do the gardening. They're not unlike our shoes today. There were slits where they probably would have the bunions to let their feet breathe. They were all different shapes. We found hundreds of them. And I popped this in because there was different types of jerkins, fastening at the sides, fastening straight over, slashed, fastening down the front. There were so many different types of them all over the ship. So skeletons in most of them, they would have just been loose otherwise, or they would have just come from the chests. It's just unbelievable what we found. It was like that captured moment in time of Tudor life. Everything just stood still at that time when the ship sank. In a personal chest, we found these objects, a comb, combs that we found, just over 70 combs. If the wider side would have been to comb the beard and the thinner side would have been to comb the hair, but in one of them, I haven't got it with me, it's in storage, but there is a flea in one of the combs still. And I know that when Prince Charles came down and Camilla, she wanted to particularly see the comb with the knit in it, so she was looking for that. And you've got the personal items, a ring, there was a ring and there was a garnet, a cross made of a garnet stone that was in the chest as well. The navigationist stuff that we found, 2 compasses at the front of the ship, 2 compasses at the back, with the navigational board that they would have done all the calculations on, and the parallel balls. I mean, if you ever go there, just have a look at the parallel, the balls that go around the mast and take up the sheets. It's just amazing. They're just all brand new. They hadn't even been used, and it's just like they were made today. And the vessels, like I said, that we found everywhere that the men would have had. We found an 8-pinter drinking vessel that the men would have had 8 pints a day for drinking beer, but it would have been watered down. These are all the different types of combs, personal items that they would have had and owned themselves. The rosary beads, as much as he found rosary beads in 1536, that we still found 13 of them on board, so they were really still had staunch Catholics, Catholics as Catholics were at that time. Skeletons, we found bones everywhere. That was a job in itself in the early days. There was no really technology to identify who belonged and what belonged to what, but that was a great job that somebody had done. As time's gone on, we're finding more about the DNA of the skeletons now, who they were, where they come from, what they actually ate. But this one was in the bones were still in the shoe itself. And we've got the skeletons here. Somebody on my last talk actually said, where are the skeletons? And I said, well, they're quite happy at the moment because they're all sitting in a box in a warm office behind in this collections that we've got. And it's really great. We've buried one of them in the cathedral in Portsmouth, and they have a ceremony every year for that. But the other skeletons are brought out, they have a day out, and they go to the university and they're getting checked out for their DNA and using this new isotopic research that they now have, and they can use the teeth to find out more about the life on board. So that's another subject in itself, actually, to talk about that. So the men that we have found so far, and the only reason we recognise them is we recognise them for what they're wearing, for maybe the strength of the muscles, maybe for the degeneration of the vertebrae or the bones where they were maybe putting the bow and arrow. And these are the locations that we found these people in. We find the bosun here. We found the Archer Royal here, trapped behind a cannon. What he was probably doing, he was probably on the upper deck and he wanted to go down and reload his arrows because he still had his part of his pack on there that he would have stored his arrows in. I didn't bring any today. And he still had his bow with him. And he was the only one on board, although a lot of the officers would have carried a pomander with them. A pomander is something that you put smellings in so you can get away with stench on ship. He was the only one that had a pomander on board. It's the only one we found. And then you've got the master gunner that was found here. He was found in a cluster of other people who were probably trying to rush up. And then you've got Henry, who they've now done the documentary and they've now found a lot more about the DNA and where he came from in his Africa and his background. And then you've got the cook that we found just here. We found the cook's mate and we found about 5 other skeletons here and we found a few up here. They were all in action stations. They were going down to prepare and collect what they needed at that time when the battle had commenced. And then we've got the carpenter. This is the carpenter's cabin here, but we actually found him on the lower deck. Why did we find him there? Was he giving his orders to his carpenter's mates? Was he actually repairing any damage that was done? Was he filling in the holes, maybe of water coming in at that time? And then you've got the purser. We haven't actually found the purser. We don't know where he is. We can't identify with him, but we have found his money belt. And we have found his cabin, which had a lot of the items in there in his stores, but maybe we'll find him, I'm sure. He was the only one that had a rolling gait. So actually they must have found it because they've done the DNA recently and detected that he had a rolling gait, so he was walking with a limp. So maybe that's the next bit of information. And the purser, the purser, that's where his cabin was just here. This is Henry. I've just said about the DNA, where he came from. He was brought up in England. He came over in the early days. They've done a lot more research on there's now a book on him that has been written by a historian. And we just can't wait to find out what the rest of the crew are and where they've come from. We found out that the carpenter was Spanish, but we knew he was Spanish because we found a lot of Spanish coins in his chest at that time as well. The master gunner, I mean, he was a strong character. He had strong muscles on his legs. He had lots of bacteria in his mouth. He lost lots of teeth. He could only chew on one side of his mouth. He had arthritis in his vertebrae, probably where he was constantly pulling in and out of the cannons. And his personal items, we found all of these in his personal chest, which was just along outside the carpenter's cabin, and a cross with 2 rings, a jerkin. Maybe it was a cross and a ring. Maybe his wife had given him before he left. And the candle holder, and the candle holder is exactly one that you see on there now. And these candle holders, there was probably more of them, but they've probably actually eroded away as the ship was there over the years. But that would have been used nearby the cannons. So when the nipper, there was two small children that we found, 13 and 14. They probably would have been the powder monkeys that would have used the linstock over here to light the candle when the master gunner gave the instructions to fire the cannon. They would have got the light from the candle, singed the engine, taken it to the gunpowder, and then the cannons would have been fired by the whistleblower of the master gunner. But what's interesting, a lot of museums you go to, you just see the cannons. What we have the carriages that the cannons were actually on. That every item, and it's just. I think I get too excited, so I've got to retain myself. I've got to slow down. And this is the Royal Archer. He's had a new jerkin made. He still had his jerkin on. As I said, he had the commander with him. He had the wrist guard on his wrist, on his skeleton as well. And that's the commander that we actually found here. But you could tell by then the DNA and the testing that they did of the wear and tear on his clavicle and the wear and tear on his fingers as well, and the wrist as well with pulling. Because I think it's probably about 17 arrows they would have to pull for every minute, and it's probably about, what, an 86-pound pull, maybe not more on that each time. I mean, this is really interesting. I've bought a Tudor bow there if anybody's interested. I haven't got the strings on it, the strings are inside, they're hard to put on, so I won't be able to do that. But these are the bows and arrows that came up, 172 plus longbows that were brought up, actually in immaculate condition. But it wasn't until they took it to North London with Robert Hardy, who was from Oxford Great Small, that's unfortunately passed away now, about 4 or 5 years ago. And what they did, when they did the testing of this, because they wanted to see if they could get the same pull as a bow today, and they did, they did it, and it was about 100 and something. But once on one of the boats, it actually broken on the ends, and that then they did the research and changed the way they were doing the conservation, because they realised there was a lot of degradation going on in the external part of the boat, and Margaret was really concerned that they had to really go through the process of longer conservation for these items. But they're all amazing. I mean, they just look so real. But Adrian brought the one bow up and he got praise and a bottle of champagne from Margaret. And I remember when Chris Dobbs brought a whole chest up and she wasn't interested. She just said, I want you to find the ends of the boats, I want you to find something else different. So he really didn't agree that day. But you can see the 80 to 160 draw on that as well. And this is what the arrows look like. And we had to leave the arrows all the time. Because Robert Hardy wanted to also investigate it before anybody else did. The barber surgeon was just an amazing find. I mean, what we found in there was just outstanding. There was 2 chests that were full of items. We found over 100 different items in the barber's surgeon cubicle. I mean, it was only probably 2'7" by 2 feet wide. He probably wouldn't have slept in there. He just would have worked in there. But here you've got physicians on one side of King Henry VIII and his surgeons on the other. It took 7 years to do an apprenticeship. And this painting by Holborn is probably still, I think it's still in Hampton Court today. And one of these men are probably one of the barber surgeons that was on board. We don't know who he is, we haven't got a face to him. But it's such a shame, because I'm thinking the names that they have here, I'm sure one of those are on there. I really wish they'd do more research on that. But we found a conif, and this is the conif, and there's a red conif over there. There was a black one, and there was a brown one. And one of my colleagues reckons they were red before they were actually dyed black. But that would have been to identify his place of office as a barber surgeon. That's what he would have worn. And then in the chest was just amazing. You know, we found 2 syringes, we found mallets, probably to knock them out with if they had to do any operations. You know, the bleeding bowls. We found a small little bit of mercury that was in the chest itself. You know, so and all the DNA has been tested on both, and they had no diseases whatsoever, which was absolutely brilliant. We found ointment bottles. We found ointments, and when you actually took the lids off the tops, you found the fingerprints still inside of the ointment, and you could still smell the menthol, whatever they were mixing in there. It went down to Plymouth University to be identified, but they couldn't identify. But it looks like a little bit like Vaseline. But everything was just amazing what we brought up, and I think that was most interesting, finding out what they used during that time. Probably no different for today. But I just wouldn't like to be under the operating table. I'm sure he wasn't there to cut hair and cut beards, but he was there to either chop off a limb or pull a teeth or something. And then we have the galley, you know, the cook that was found in the galley, you know, the knife marks that he'd left on that bench that he probably had also sat on whilst the food was being cooked. And these are his personal items that we found in his chest also. And the bucket, you can see the leather bucket over there, there's an identical one there that was there. There was quite a few leather buckets that we found. A lot of them were very clean and clear, that we reckon it was to transport food up to the next level for the crew, because a lot of them had pitching that would have been used for the ship repair, but also a lot of them would have been there to actually transport, because they only had big bowls to eat out at that time, and they would have used their fingers to eat with. And then you've got the galley. What's interesting about the galley, Chris Dobbs went down to read the search on the galley, so it's getting deeper down. And he kept bringing these house bricks up, and it's kind of, we don't understand it. And we were saying, oh, somebody's chucked the bricks over there. But over 300 bricks came up in the end. But then what he did, he took loads of photographs, put them together as a collage, and he realised that it was the galley. And these huge cauldrons that were going on top, there was 2 side by side. So as the ship tipped over, it would have taken the whole of the cauldrons out. But there was a stack of wooden plates, probably just being used, and the cook was cooking for the food for the men at that time. On the front of the bricks, there were still footprints of maybe the dog. You know, and the officers would have eaten differently to the crew. The crew would have just had what they got in the cauldron, but the officers would have had the haunches of meat cooked over the fire. And all the pots, we've got the pots as it would have been then. But I'm just going to show you a little video because it will put a little bit more of a picture together for you.
And brass cauldrons found deep in the hold of the ship The archaeologists have been able to construct a picture of what the Mary Rose's galley might have looked like, and from this, work out how they would have cooked. Animal bones found on board suggest the food the crew may have been eating in their last few days. Meat was in abundance, beef and pork, as well as fish, and even a haunch of venison. The menu wasn't just meat. There would have been greens and peas, and even methods of making the food taste a little better. A pepper grinder and peppercorns were also discovered in the wreck. There were even clues about how they ate scattered throughout the ship.
After the food was transferred to their own individual bowl or plate, the Tudor seamen would have really just used their own knives and their fingers. Forks hadn't been brought into English society at that stage, and spoons would be reserved for people of higher status. And you notice that the plates have markings from knives where they've been used to cut food, but the bowls don't. So the bowls weren't used for eating with their knives.
And where there's food, there's drink.
Most of the crew would have drunk beer, and at that time the ration was about a gallon of beer a day, 8 pints, which sounds great to us, but it would have been very, very much watered down beer and used because it was just so much more healthy than water, because fewer bugs would grow in it because the yeast grows and produces the beer.
So remember, and this is how
the officers would have drunk wine, and they would have eaten in a much more refined way. Their food would have been taken to them and served from a dresser onto their pewter plates. The officers had one other added extra with their meals: music.
We've got that tonight.
The carpenter and his mates would have maintained the ship. Everything from mending rigging blocks to repairing damage made by cannonballs during battle.
Well, in our wooden society, it's a wooden ship. Everything's made from wood, so a carpenter's got some status on board the ship. He has his own cabin, but also within the cabin we found a chest. It was full of tools. They're not unusual. They're tools that I see in my own dad's shed.
So after we'd retrieved over 20,000 items from the seabed, the Mary Rose was left there through the winter. She was looked after and monitored, but then in the March of the following year of 1982, then there was thousands of tons of crud that had actually sand and that had got down. So she was airlifted again. Salvage divers got involved at this stage, and they'd taken all these sills that had been building up over the winter. Then they were getting ready for the lift. So the lift was that salvage divers had to go down under the hull of the ship and funnel under the ship. Let's see, where am I here? Yeah, here. So it was very dark, pitch black, and you can imagine the hull that's on the bottom, and what the salvage divers had to do. They tunnelled down here with using high water jets, and it was very dark, and the frame that was coming in at that time to attach to the Mary Rose hull. So one diver had to then drill through the starboard side, and the diver underneath had to then take the bolt and put the bolt on, and it was done in pitch black. They couldn't really see what they were doing. So what they did gradually, they put the strop round that was held on to the frame, which I'll show you in a moment, until they did 200. 200 of these had to be done. Then when the strops were attached, these are the big bolts that had to be put through. So what they did, they got the frame that came out from Marchwood. The base of the frame sat next to the hull on the seabed. And then they positioned the part of the frame that was then going to lift her up into the frame and position her down into the bottom of the frame. Then they were going to bolt the frames together. That had to be achieved first. So what they did, bolted on 200 of these strops, lifted this up gradually, because if you've got welly boot in mud, you can't just lift it up, you've got to shake it about. And this is what they had to do, so they had to joggle it up a little bit until they lifted that suction out of the seabed. And then they lifted her over, and then they placed her down into the frame that was already placed on the seabed. That's when she was lifted, and this is some of you are quite young, probably can't remember this bit.
437 years, the skeletal ribs of Henry VIII's tragic warship emerged to a triumphant salute of sirens and gunfire. In May 80 this year, the Mary Rose is still an awesome sight to behold. And for none more so than project director Margaret Ruhl, for whom this was an act of faith. Nearly 700 soldiers and seamen died when the Mary Rose foundered as she sailed from Portsmouth to encounter the French fleet watched aghast by Henry VIII. His royal descendant 4 centuries later had witnessed the warship's recovery with no less fascination. Then, as divers worked to buoy her up, the Mary Rose went through another heart-stopping drama.
So you all remember that's taking you back nearly 40 years ago. That's what happened 40 years ago. It's the anniversary this year of the lift. The bell was actually found underneath the hull at that time, so we knew it's the Mary Rose. And then the Mary Rose was brought up, and she was in conservation process. And then items were freeze-dried, like you get in freeze-dried coffee. They were freeze-dried, ready to go back into the temporary museum that they were having, and that they'd opened at that time before the new museum was built. The new museum was built. Down on the seabed at the moment is still the castle decks. And when I said to you at the very beginning, was she hit by a cannonball? Was she actually hit by a cannonball? We'll never know that. Maybe the next generation that goes down there will find that out. Museum was opened in 2013. She was air dried for 3 years in that container. You couldn't see through if anything had gone down at that stage. And then it's open for viewing. And I know some of you have already been down there, but it's just amazing. When you go now into the start, you get the King Henry VIII telling you a little bit about the history of the Mary Rose itself. And when you go there, you can see all these just amazing views. And if you go to the top level, you can see over. There's nothing in front of you at all, no glass doors, and you can actually smell the wood and the ropes and everything as it was. And she looks absolutely beautiful. Has anybody been down at this stage to see her? No, this is what you're going to see. You're missing out. Very naughty. I can't tell you off too much because I'm being watched. And then we have the education going on for the students, the university students, the school kids that come round. They want to put our diving suit on and wear everything. But you know, if it wasn't for these two people, we would probably never have had the Mary Rose. And I think a lot of people in Solent probably didn't even know about the Battle of Solent at that time until Alexander McKee had found the wreck. And I think, you know, it's great. I think it's a great history right on our doorstep that we've all got. And I think they need a lot more recognition than they've actually got, these two people themselves. So,
in Hull and the artifacts found within it, it is now possible to build up a picture of life aboard the Mary Rose. A ship that was shrouded in mystery can now be brought to life.
So that's a quick history, a little bit about the Mary Rose. I'm trying to speed it up. Am I off camera? Can I say what I've got to say? Am I off now? Am I off now?
A few moments.
No. Oh, great.